Welcome to this week's discussion of servant leadership, authentic leadership, and emotionally intelligent leadership. I've assembled a set of readings and media that delve into these three uniquely interesting and related views of leadership. This presentation provides background and context to get you started. I hope you'll enjoy this opportunity to ponder the significance of these leadership approaches with respect to the contemporary work organization and also with respect to your own job role. A good place to start our discussion is by asking the question, what is leadership? Those of you who have previously spent time studying the subject of leadership will already know that this question is much more easily asked than answered. There's no single prevailing definition, though there is indeed general consensus in the academic literature that leadership involves a process of social influence. Thus, we might also be inclined to agree that the effective leader within a work organization influences the attitudes, the behaviors, and the performance of followers. The ultimate aim, of course, is the achievement of key organizational goals and outcomes. The field of leadership is theory-rich, and many different approaches have been developed to describe and explain the leadership phenomenon. The earliest approach to studying leadership was the trait approach, which focused on the personal characteristics of great leaders, such as personality, intelligence, empathy, perceptiveness, self-confidence, or supportiveness. This approach to examining leadership was abandoned in favor of other approaches when it became difficult to consistently link particular traits with leader outcomes. But it's very interesting to note a more recent resurgence of interest in this approach, and you may even detect overlap with definitions of servant leadership, which do indeed place some focus on leader characteristics. Other approaches to leadership have focused on the impact of leader behavior, for example, task-oriented behavior and relationship-oriented behavior. Situational approaches to studying leadership have underscored the interaction between leadership effectiveness and the situation. For example, what kind of task lies before the leader, and how much control does the leader have over potential work outcomes? Participative approaches address the positive impact of involving work groups in decision-making processes, while the power approach examines the results that occur when leaders apply influence tactics. Transactional approaches explore the ways in which leaders can use role clarification, goal setting, and reward contingencies to impact work outcomes, while finally, and very importantly, transformational leadership focuses on transforming followers by inspiring commitment to a vision, serving as a role model, providing support, and engendering an environment in which questions and innovation can thrive. Transformational leadership previews this week's discussion of authentic leadership. Three additional leadership perspectives are servant leadership, authentic leadership, and emotionally intelligent leadership. Servant leadership has been described as a philosophy of leadership that paradoxically integrates the terms servant and leadership. Unlike the approaches described on the previous slide, servant leadership does not arise from academic research. Rather, it's centered upon a belief about what the role of a leader should be. In other words, a servant with respect to the organizational community. Authentic leadership has a research basis, for example, interviews with hundreds of executives. And it's captured the interest of both academics and practitioners, answering the call for integrity and transparency in leadership. The authentic leadership framework is values-based and relational. Emotionally intelligent leadership can be said to underlie both servant leadership and authentic leadership. Emotional intelligence is a very significant leadership construct, generally refers to social intelligence. The definition on this slide from mindtools.com actually offers a very nice overview of what it's all about. And here's a quote. Emotional intelligence is the ability to recognize your emotions, understand what they're telling you, and realize how your emotions affect people around you. It also involves your perception of others. When you understand how they feel, this allows you to manage relationships more effectively. Emotional intelligence has become increasingly prominent in the field of leadership and very important with respect to our ability to understand leader effectiveness, hence its inclusion in our course. Let's take a closer look at each perspective. Robert Greenleaf was the founder of the servant leadership philosophy, the notion that the leader is servant first. Hailing from Indiana, Robert Greenleaf worked in the area of management development at AT&T, but he retired early and began to write about his ideas on management and leadership. His work represents a unique contribution to the field of leadership, and there's been a recent resurgence of interest in the servant-first philosophy, hence its placement in this course. Let's take a moment to read a quote from Greenleaf's very famous essay on this subject. He writes, "The servant leader is servant first. It begins with the natural feeling that one wants to serve first. Then conscious choice brings one to aspire to lead. That person is sharply different from one who is leader first, perhaps because of the need to assuage an unusual power drive or to acquire material possessions. The leader first and the servant first are two extreme types. Between them there are shadings and blends that are part of the infinite variety of human nature." So, this emphasis on serving the needs of others first is, generally speaking, a philosophical point of departure from other leadership approaches. This philosophy has struck a chord with many contemporary management and leadership authors, such as Kenneth Blanchard, Margaret Wheatley, Stephen Covey. If you read their work, you'll see that they have been influenced by the leader as servant philosophy. And there's further evidence of this leadership philosophy's growing influence. Anecdotally, when asked about leadership style, many practitioners will answer that they see themselves as servant leaders. In fact, you'll see this phenomenon in this week's readings and materials. So a good question to ask is, what are the characteristics of a servant leader? The servant leader exhibits 10 key characteristics as depicted on this slide: listening, empathy, healing, awareness, persuasion, conceptualization, foresight, stewardship, commitment to the growth of people, and building community. You'll read more about them during this week in the course. Do you notice that some of these characteristics hark back to trait theory, such as empathy, and others are consistent with leadership theories that emphasize relationship-oriented behaviors, such as listening? Foresight reflects the importance of vision, an important element of transformational leadership. Yet these 10 characteristics also speak to a uniqueness that is inherent in the servant-first philosophy, such as healing or stewardship. The servant leader exhibits 10 key characteristics as depicted on this slide: listening, empathy, healing, awareness, persuasion, conceptualization, foresight, stewardship, commitment to the growth of people, and building community. You'll read more about them during this week in the course. Do you notice that some of these characteristics hark back to trait theory, such as empathy, and others are consistent with leadership theories that emphasize relationship-oriented behaviors, such as listening? Foresight reflects the importance of vision, an important element of transformational leadership. Yet these 10 characteristics add. How do we recognize the impact of servant leadership? Well, the outcomes of servant leadership are described by Robert Greenleaf as follows. Do those served grow as persons? Do they, while being served, become healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous, more likely themselves to become servants? This notion that followers are personally transformed and that their growth represents a primary leadership outcome, underscores the unique servant-first leadership philosophy. Do you see how this philosophy is different from more traditional approaches to defining leadership? The idea of influence from our initial definition is still there, but the overriding purpose is service. A current and preeminent emphasis in the area of leadership is authentic leadership, based heavily on interviews with practicing leaders and borrowing from theories and frameworks such as transformational leadership and servant leadership. Let's take a moment to read a quote from Rob Goffey and Gareth Jones on this subject. Goffey and Jones are prolific authors on the subject of leadership and place emphasis on authenticity in leadership. Here's a quote. "Followers choose to be led by humans, not titles, credentials, or management clones. Identify and deploy your personal differences, foibles, and strengths to remind people you're human and to inspire them to apply their energy and talents to help you. Who are you and where do you come from? What's different about you that will rouse others to follow?" So authentic leaders really know themselves. In other words, they're very self-aware. This self-knowledge has informed their leadership journey. They have reflected on and derived meaning from their life experiences, and they know where their strengths and weaknesses lie. They know what they believe, and they know what they value, and they lead with an eye toward building relationships and building trust. So overall, we could say that the authentic leadership framework approach is a very relational perspective on leadership. Across authors, research studies, and readings, you'll find that the characteristics of authentic leaders include leading from a place of passion, values, and vision, focusing on relationships and transparency in communication, and heightened self-awareness. The latter point, self-awareness, is very important in this leadership framework. It's an acknowledgement that a leader has to really understand her or his own life story and has to have reflected upon and learned from life experiences in order to effectively lead others. In other words, leadership has to start with learning about oneself, strengths, areas for development, and purpose. And this harks back to our discussions of the leadership journey and crucibles. Let's take a closer look. Bill George, former Medtronic CEO, current Harvard business professor, and author of Discover Your True North, an exploration of authentic leadership, offers a 5-pronged framework that enhances our understanding of the authentic leader. There are 5 key leadership dimensions in his framework. Pursuing purpose with passion, which is knowing why you want to lead and what your leadership can bring to others, to organizations, to the community, and so on. Practicing solid values, and this strikes a chord for those seeking answers to why organizations such as Enron or WorldCom veered so far away from an ethical center. Leading with heart, that's a reference in part to empathy, but also to courage in decision-making. Establishing enduring relationships, that's relatability, access, openness. And demonstrating self-discipline, setting standards for one's own performance, and holding self and others accountable. The authentic leader is a relatable leader who cares about the organization's employees and who communicates with transparency. Importantly, the authentic leader also sets the standards, including values-based norms that steer the organization and its employees toward a vision. Emotional intelligence is a complex construct with an entire set of underlying competencies. As you view this slide, you'll see that we've already visited some of these competencies in both servant leadership and authentic leadership. What exactly is EI, or emotional intelligence? The research surrounding emotional intelligence is still relatively new, and there are a number of different frameworks and definitions available. When you think about it, that's not entirely unusual. As we're learning, the construct of leadership itself is defined in many different ways. The value lies in studying a particular framework and then evaluating its usefulness to our own work, our own careers, and our development as managers and leaders. In this course, we'll refer to an EI, Emotional Intelligence Framework, proposed by Daniel Goleman, a longtime EI researcher. His framework offers a strong application orientation. He views EI as having a set of competencies that you see depicted on this slide. Self-awareness is our ability to know ourselves. What are our strengths? Where do our weaknesses lie? Do we know what we value? Do we know what motivates us? What are our goals? So, do you see the connection there with leading authentically? Self-regulation references our ability to control our moods and impulses, and it's easy to see, I think, how that would be very important to effective leadership. Motivation addresses passion and drive, and there's also a clear connection to the authentic leadership framework here. Empathy or social awareness taps into the ability to understand how others are feeling and to really get where they're coming from. This is akin to putting ourselves in someone else's shoes. Social skill or relationship management addresses the ability to manage relationships. From the point of view of leadership, this has direct relevance to motivating others to follow your vision, your passion, and to inspire and lead change. What are the outcomes of emotionally intelligent leadership? This week's readings are replete with examples of how emotionally intelligent leadership drives organizational performance and productivity through the leader's ability to successfully communicate, encourage, and influence. Can EI be learned? Can we improve our EI skills? Well, there are differing opinions in this area, but Goleman says we can develop our EI skills. Note in particular that leadership coaching is one successful method. What is your perspective as you read and view this week's materials on servant leadership, authentic leadership, and emotionally intelligent leadership? Take a few moments to ponder the questions presented on this slide. Are servant leadership, authentic leadership, and emotionally intelligent leadership compelling approaches to understanding and describing leadership in organizations? Do you agree that characteristics such as healing from servant leadership or self-awareness from authentic leadership and EI can drive performance and ultimately transform employees, teams, and organizations? Should the characteristics of servant leadership, authentic leadership, and emotionally intelligent leadership be cultivated in the context of the managerial role? In other words, should these characteristics be cultivated throughout the managerial ranks in an organization? If so, how can each of us strive to do so? I very much look forward to hearing your views during this week's class discussions.